One executive who had seemed to fall away from Eisner's watchful eye was Steve Burke. Burke had been running the Disney store chain, leading to large profits and widespread success, when Eisner decided to switch things up. Eisner had a philosophy that a good manager can run any kind of business, and assigned Burke as manager of Euro Disneyland. Burke had been hesitant to leave the Disney stores, enjoying his position there, but the prospect of managing a Disney theme park was undoubtedly enticing. Unfortunately, Euro Disneyland was not doing very well upon opening. The park had been recently renamed Disneyland Paris, and although it was still underperforming financially, it had been restructured to be more stable for the time being. Still, it was a stain on Eisner's track record, and he tended to ignore it, focusing on bigger projects. As his children were beginning to reach school age, Burke expressed interest in moving back to the US and transitioning to a different role at the company. Eisner had promised to bring Burke back at some point, but kept blowing him off whenever asked. But while Eisner had seemed content to overlook Burke, he had caught the attention of Katzenberg, who called and asked to meet in Paris. When they sat down together, Katzenberg cut right to the chase, asking Burke to come to DreamWorks. Burke was surprised and flattered, but hesitant. "I feel a lot of loyalty towards Michael," he said. Katzenberg gave him a warning. "I promise you, someday that will change. Michael Eisner has no loyalty to you." "Yes, he does," Burke said, but Katzenberg continued. "Let me tell you something. Fundamentally, Michael doesn't care about anybody else. Maybe his wife, but all Michael cares about is Michael." In 1997, Eisner was presented with a new 10-year contract. In this new deal, Eisner's base pay would remain the same at $750,000 annually, but his bonus formula and stock options were increased, allowing him to make more money by the end of the 10-year period. Notably, the contract outlined that if Eisner was ever dismissed from his position, he would be entitled to a full cash payout of the remaining value of his contract, further securing his future at the company. By this point, Eisner had accumulated enough stocks to become the second highest individual shareholder, higher than Roy or Diane Disney, and only falling below the Basses. When Eisner's contract was completed, he exercised some of his stock options for $545 million, making him once again the highest paid executive in America. And Eisner was not the only one pulling from the mouse's wallet. The termination of Ovitz had reportedly cost the company around $140 million once a settlement was reached. And the ongoing court battle between Disney and Katzenberg was costing Disney more and more each time Eisner refused to make a deal. Money was flying all over the place at the Magic Kingdom, and too much was going towards all of the missteps and failures Eisner had made along the way. So it might be fair to ask, why was he getting so much money? Well, the new contract was put together by board member Erwin Russell, who also happened to be Eisner's personal lawyer. This should be a clear conflict of interest, but nobody ever seems to have brought that issue up. And the reason for that was because practically every member of the board at this point in time was beholden to Eisner in one way or another. Here are a few examples of board members and their various allegiances to Eisner. Revita Bowers was the principal for the Center for Early Education, a school in West Hollywood that Eisner and many Disney executives sent their children to, and supported with large donations. Similarly, Leo O'Donovan was the president of Georgetown University, where Eisner's son Breck graduated from, and Eisner continued to support with donations. Robert Stern was Eisner's personal architect. George Mitchell's law firm earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees from representing Disney. There were those, such as Sandy Litvak, who actually fell under Eisner's leadership in the company, and of course were loyal to him as a result. And recently, Eisner had brought on a new board member, Andrea Van de Kamp. Van de Kamp was the chairman of the Los Angeles Music Center. The center had been working with Lillian Disney, Walt's widow, to create the Walt Disney Concert Hall, meant to celebrate Walt's love of music. Lillian had donated $50 million, but Van de Kamp and her team quickly realized that that would not be enough and reached out to the company for help. Eisner did not care for the project, but after months of lobbying to meet with him, Van de Kamp finally got to sit down with Eisner. "Are we here to talk about a movie?" he asked. "Because I'm against the Walt Disney Concert Hall." Van de Kamp shot back, "Should I leave now, or can I finish my coffee?" Eisner laughed, and with that, she got to work convincing him to rally the board to provide financial support for the project. Eisner was hesitant, but Van de Kamp was smart, tapping into Eisner's love for architecture and impressing him with her presentation skills and persuasiveness. In the end, she got what she needed. Eisner stood to leave, but suddenly got an idea. He turned back. "You're a good salesman. Maybe you should work here." And within a few months, she became a member of the board. Another member who, perhaps in his view, owed Eisner to some degree. At this stage, there were very few left to oppose Eisner's choices. There were those such as Roy and Gold, as well as Card Walker before he retired, who occasionally pushed for Eisner to name his successor, as he had failed to do repeatedly. But now, it seemed that Eisner had dropped any pretense of trying to do so. The company once again had no president, but Eisner seemed to be in no hurry to fill that slot. Litvak and Roth were floated as potential options, but Eisner shot both of them down. He was at the top of the company, the sole king of the Magic Kingdom, and he was not planning to relinquish that power anytime soon. Meanwhile, as Disney was spending its money on Eisner and the messes he had helped cause, the company itself was on a downward trend. Euro Disneyland had been a massive failure that continued to lose the company millions of dollars and hold the entire parks division back. Meanwhile, a string of live-action failures forced the company to restructure Touchstone Pictures and Hollywood Pictures to all work under Buena Vista Distribution and to reduce output altogether. ABC continued to have issues creating a solid lineup of programming, and the company was moved from New York to Los Angeles, to the frustration of Bob Iger. And worse, the Disney Renaissance was quickly coming to a close. After The Lion King came Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Hercules, which all paled in comparison both financially and critically. The release of Tarzan a few years later would officially be the end of the renaissance of Disney animation, and the declining interest in the company's films meant the consumer products division was suffering as well. Disney stores began shuttering their doors one by one, as without a hit film with a hit cast of marketable characters, there were less toys to sell. The only films that seemed to be doing well were projects released in partnership with Pixar. But Steve Jobs, chairman of the board at Pixar, was finding Eisner impossible to work with. The two companies had worked out an agreement to create a set amount of films together. But after the success of Toy Story and Toy Story 2, Eisner insisted that sequels would not count per their agreement, meaning they would have to make more films than they expected with Disney. Jobs balked at this, and refused to negotiate further with Eisner, indicating an oncoming divorce of the two companies. This seemed to be the worst thing for Disney. If their own films were failing, why would they want to cut ties with the group contributing to their greatest successes? But Eisner's anger with Jobs led him to badmouth the company to the Disney board, saying that the oncoming release of Finding Nemo would be a rude awakening for Pixar, as Eisner did not think it was any good. But Eisner's feud with Jobs was nothing compared to his ongoing battle with Katzenberg. Katzenberg refused a settlement of $117 million, wanting instead to force Eisner to go to court and testify. Disney had not anticipated that Katzenberg's legal team would subpoena the notes taken by Tony Schwartz for Eisner's autobiography. These notes detailed Eisner's exact feelings regarding Katzenberg every single time they had an issue, and provided insight into many things the company did not want to be known. Worst of all was Project Snowball, the secret operation meant to calculate how much it would cost to get rid of Katzenberg. Katzenberg's lawyer, Burt Fields, questioned Eisner on the stand. Eisner maintained he had never heard of Project Snowball, and this had to be an initiative put into motion by Wells before his passing, but Katzenberg's legal team was not buying it. "You never heard or saw the name Project Snowball?" Fields questioned. "No, not that I recall." But when Fields handed Eisner a memo addressed to him, titled Project Snowball, it was hard to deny his involvement. Still, Eisner played dumb. "I don't think I ever saw this memo." Fields handed him another memo, titled Project Snowball, Highly Confidential, from Frank and Cheryl F. to Michael Eisner. "You didn't see that one either?" Eisner maintained his ignorance, but Fields continued, asking further embarrassing and revealing questions. "Did you consider yourself the cheerleader, and Mr. Katzenberg merely the tip of your pom-pom?" "No." "Didn't you say that to Mr. Schwartz? That's how you looked at him?" "Mr. Schwartz had that in his notes, I believe. I don't think I ever said it." If I said it, I'm quite sure it was in humor. You don't think Mr. Schwartz made that up, do you? Eisner was finding himself backed into a corner. I don't know. Do you think he made it up? Probably not. So you probably said it. In humor. This was embarrassing for Eisner, but nothing compared to the next question. Did you tell Mr. Schwartz that you hated Mr. Katzenberg? In one conversation when he pushed me on things that Katzenberg had done, I did say that. You said, quote, I think I hate that little mutant. Eisner grew uncomfortable. He tried to protest that his personal feelings towards Katzenberg did not belong in the public record, but Fields cut him off. Didn't you say on more than one occasion that you hated Mr. Katzenberg to Mr. Schwartz? I probably did hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviewing Mr. Schwartz, probably out of humor, out of gross unpleasantness. Eisner continued on, claiming he did not hate Katzenberg and that this line of questioning was in nobody's best interest. But Fields ignored this and asked his final question. Did you say to Mr. Schwartz, I don't care what he thinks, I am not going to pay him any of the money? I would say again, in anger, I said that. And with that, Fields rested his case. Eisner's team quickly rallied to his defense, providing context to each comment which they hoped would dispel any controversy. But Eisner was right about one thing. Katzenberg had a talent for playing to the media, and the media had little concern over Eisner's defense. The colorful and offensive insults Eisner had thrown at Katzenberg made sensational headlines, while internally, Eisner had made numerous steps to secure his power at the top of the company. Outside of the business, people were beginning to question his leadership. After all, Disney had always been known as a family-focused company and had tried to maintain a cleaner image than most studios. But with their dirty laundry being aired out in court, the magic of the Magic Kingdom faded just a little bit. These quotes lent the public insight into the rule of a bitter king, who trampled those who stood in his way. By the time the settlement was reached, Disney owed Katzenberg $280 million, a far cry from the $60 million he had asked for in the beginning. Eisner's stubbornness and refusal to negotiate, despite pressure from Geffen and Ovitz, had cost Disney far too much, for no reason at all. Despite having so many in the board on his side, pressures from Wall Street and the media could not be ignored forever. Once again, Stanley Gold raised the question of naming a successor, along with Tom Murphy and a few other board members. ABC was finally on the upswing with the success of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and Bob Iger was looking like the ideal candidate. Eisner became irate when questioned, however, and chose to launch into a tirade listing the many weaknesses of Iger. Iger can never succeed me, he said, pointing out that Iger was hardly the creative type and lacked the stature to lead a company such as Disney. Tom Murphy, seeing how Eisner really felt about Iger, warned him, prompting Iger to consider leaving in the following year. But despite his clear resistance, Eisner felt enough pressure to discuss the possibility of naming Iger as the new president. Iger had been pining for the position for some time, but when finally being given consideration for the job, Iger hesitated. Are you sure? He asked. You seem to be hot and cold on me. Eisner was taken aback. It was rare for someone in the company to be so candid with him. He did not answer the question right away, but later at dinner with their wives, Eisner revealed his true feelings on the matter. Every time I think of naming a president, I feel like I'm competing with myself. Iger became agitated. That's ridiculous. I'm not trying to take your job. It's enough to be president of the Walt Disney Company. Despite his fear of losing power or competing with a successor, Eisner relented, naming Bob Iger the president and COO of the company in early 2000. And this caused quite a stir within the executive team. It turns out that when somebody surrounds themselves with a group of people all hoping for a promotion, promises them all the same promotion, and gives it to someone they all hardly knew was in the running, that does not go over very well. Among those who felt jilted was Sandy Litvak. Long had he done Eisner's bidding at every turn. He was the one sent to tell Ovitz to get out, and had put up with Eisner's nonsense during the Katzenberg trial. But in the end, it meant nothing. I always felt like I wanted to be a member of Michael's club, Litvak said of the matter, and then I discovered there wasn't any club. Peter Schneider planned to resign upon hearing the news, telling Joe Roth of his plans, only to find Roth felt similarly. I wouldn't if I were you. I'm going to resign and then you can have the damn job. So around the time Iger was named second in command at Disney, Litvak, Roth, Schneider, and more in the executive team left the company. Iger had won the battle, but he would still have to contend with Eisner's competitive, petty, and temperamental nature. Soon after the announcement was made, the two of them made an appearance at a media event, but Eisner refused to be pictured with Iger at any point during the night. Why would he want to be seen with his competitor, after all? During a company retreat, Disney brought in an outside consultant to interview each executive about their experience in the company and identify any strengths and weaknesses in the team. The goal was to help enhance synergy and teamwork, but only a few interviews in, the consultant quickly saw that the Disney executive team had a massive problem. In the interviews, some were closed off, offering as little of their opinions as possible. Some sugarcoated their feelings, suspecting that the consultant would be reporting the results directly to Eisner. But there were a few bold enough to state the obvious. The team did not trust one another, and the root of that distrust was Eisner himself. After collecting the data from each interview, the consultant nervously prepared to present his results to the team. The results of my research indicate that you guys are not a good team. You're not a team at all. You're not even a group. The men who were less than a group sat in awkward silence. Eisner scoffed. "How can you say that? You haven't been to my Monday lunches," he said, referring to his weekly staff meetings. With the silence broken, the men quickly launched into arguments with one another, some insisting that they were a team, and others pointing out that they obviously were not. The consultant sat there, presumably wondering if anybody had noticed that they were proving his point. Later, some commented further on the obvious issues. One summed up the issue well, saying, quote, "What Michael likes is to put 6 pit bulls together and see which 5 die." Clearly, the Disney executive team had a company culture that was rotten to its core, and the rot had run from branch to branch, all spreading from one bad apple, Michael Eisner. Under Eisner's leadership, the company had quickly been taking a turn for the worse culturally and also financially. Eisner had recently decided that Disney should purchase another cable network, Fox Family, despite the fact that they were struggling with ABC. This cost around $5 billion, and after struggling to find success on the network, Disney quickly realized that they had massively overpaid. And the decisions made by Eisner and his team seemed to defy logic. After the failure of Disneyland Paris, Eisner had gone ahead opening a second gate, Disney Studios. The park was tiny compared to those that came before it, with very few rides available on opening day. Van de Kamp voiced some concerns to the rest of the board. "There's not enough substance to keep people here for a full day. People are already leaving, and the park has only been open for a few hours." It was only a few minutes before Eisner had heard what Van de Kamp had said, and made a beeline straight towards her. "I understand you've been griping." Eisner could afford to treat his fellow executives in this manner, since he had not only most of the board members on his side, but he had long held the favor of the largest individual shareholders, the Bass family. Over the years, the Bass family had each gone their separate ways, but each maintained a substantial hold in the company. Eisner had impressed the family when he launched Disney from fading relevance to a financial giant. Together, Eisner and the Basses held a controlling stake in Disney. As long as Eisner had the Basses on his side, he had little reason to worry about gaining the favor of other shareholders or even many of those in the company. But that all changed when Eisner received a shocking phone call from Sid Bass. The stock market was continuing to sink lower and lower, as a recession was sure to happen soon. Worse, the Disney stock had dropped substantially from the highs of the Eisner era. This put the Bass family in a position where they felt they had to sell off their shares in Disney, a collective 6.4% stake. Eisner was shocked. He had been close with the Basses ever since the beginning, and without them, he knew his grip on the power structure of Disney would inevitably loosen. The company was forced to buy back 50 million shares to protect their interests, costing them more money that they had no business spending. However, there were still a few branches free from Eisner's control, including a branch that ran straight to the roots of the company itself, Roy Disney Jr. Roy had brought Eisner and Wells into the company at a time when it was in immediate danger of being bought and scrapped for parts. And this proved to be a wild success, not only saving the company from takeover, but allowing the company to reach new heights they could have only dreamed of. Disney had gone from a studio fading from relevancy to a massive player in Hollywood. But Eisner, in the absence of Wells, had felt like less of a lucky charm for the company than he used to be. Wells had been involved in a number of missteps in the company, such as Euro Disneyland and Project Snowball. But regardless, it was clear that Wells's death, as well as Eisner's heart surgery, served as a dividing line between when times were good and times were bad. Looking at the company as a whole, since 1995 they had been steadily declining in profits. Roy began to voice his concerns to Stanley Gold, fearing Eisner would lead the company into the same precarious position he had found it in, and Gold was beginning to develop concerns of his own. As the chairman of the Executive Compensation Committee, Gold had been presented with a $9 million contract for Stu Bloomberg, who had been leading ABC's primetime schedule. While the network had found success with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the program faded from relevance after it was overscheduled and surrounded with less popular shows. Eisner and Iger had been heavily involved in many decisions regarding ABC, and it could be fair to point fingers at them, rather than Bloomberg, who was just following orders. Either way though, it seemed odd to provide Bloomberg with a lucrative contract when the network he was in charge of programming was failing because of its terrible programming. During a dinner meeting with Eisner and the Compensation Committee, Gold voiced his frustrations to his fellow directors in confidence, criticizing the contract and Disney's performance in general. But as the dinner ended and everybody got up to leave, Eisner pulled Gold aside. His face was bright red. He had heard about Gold's complaining, and he was furious. "You're talking to everybody. You're causing trouble. Everybody tells me you're upset." Once again, it seemed that Eisner had eyes and ears everywhere, but Gold stood firm. "I'm just talking to other directors, and I am upset. Your behavior is outrageous." But Gold again stood firm. It was his job to make decisions on how much people should be paid, and more broadly, to speak up about issues he saw within the company. But Eisner cut straight to the point. "Are you saying you're losing confidence in me? Are the two of you?" He knew that even if Roy was not there, Gold represented him in spirit. "Because if you are, then I'll resign. Is that what you want?" Eisner had made the promise all those years ago to leave when asked, but Gold knew Roy was not ready to make such an earth-shattering decision. Not yet. "No, but I'm getting close." Bloomberg was fired soon after receiving his lucrative contract, which cost the company more money it had no reason to spend. So in the end, it seemed Gold had been right to be concerned, and Eisner, seeing the voices of dissent growing louder, was growing concerned himself. Eisner could see that many on the board, empowered by his shrinking hold of power on the company, were feeling more comfortable raising concerns and questioning his authority. Worse, many outside of the board began to question the independence of its members. So many had either been tied to Eisner personally or profiting off the company significantly that it was becoming harder to ignore. So Gold, seizing his opportunity, began to call for a structural reform. It harkened back to the reform he had called for in the past, which led to the ousting of Ron Miller. The similarity was certainly not lost on Eisner, but Eisner, who was fed up with Gold undermining him, decided that perhaps a reform could work in his favor. Disney teamed up with an outside firm, led by Ira Milstein, to help identify any conflicts of interest in the company and restructure the company in a way that prevented this. From the outside, that sounds like the perfect plan. But on the inside, Gold and Roy knew this may be a problem. Eisner had so many people on his side that they worried he would be able to work the restructuring in a way that ousted anybody who opposed him. And when the firm's results came out, it seems that their fears were correct. They found that Stanley Gold was no longer considered an independent because his daughter held a job in consumer products. A permanent ruling would be held later to make a final determination about whether or not Gold could keep his job as the chairman of the Governance and Nominating Committee, as well as the Compensations Committee. But in the meantime, he would have to share his position with Eisner loyalist George Mitchell. Mitchell, remember, was the one who had earned $2 million through his law firm's work with Disney, a pretty apparent conflict of interest that nobody seemed to question. It was clear that Eisner wanted Gold out, and there was a looming threat that those who opposed him would be kicked out as well. It was around this time that the media began to catch wind of the rift between Eisner and Gold, along with Roy. Eisner accused Gold of going to the press, which he denied. Eisner insisted he wanted to keep their differences behind closed doors, and Gold agreed. But Gold became frustrated when he found that Ray Watson, one of the board members who had been considering pushing for Eisner's resignation, praised the CEO in the press. Quote, "We have no interest in going out and bringing an unknown into this company and this difficult industry when we believe we already have the best CEO in the business." To Gold, it was clear that Eisner had directed him to say this, and that Watson was not as willing to stand up to Eisner as he had initially seemed. And worse, in Gold's view, Eisner was controlling the narrative by only presenting his side of the story. So Gold drafted a letter to the directors, in which he criticized Watson for wavering on his opinion of Eisner. Gold referred to the exact lunch where Watson had criticized Eisner, what he said, and just revealed a lot of embarrassing details about how Watson felt. But at the end, Gold referred to a larger failure on the part of the board. "We, the directors, are guilty of not discussing the real issues affecting the company. We have not fully and critically addressed the failed plans of our executives or the broken promises that management had made to the board and the shareholders over the last 5 years. We are too polite, too concerned with hurting each other's feelings, when our real job is A, to protect the shareholders, and B, to coalesce around a management team and a plan that we believe will get us out of our current malaise. I hope you will receive my comments in the spirit in which they are offered. Serious concern by a director who believes that we, the Disney directors, have long been too compliant and uncritical of management's failures. We can no longer accept as fact that all of the bad things that happen to Disney are out of management's control, and all of the good things are a result of having, quote, the best CEO in the business. Kindest personal regards, Stanley P. Gold." The letter was harsh, and many wondered if it was the right approach. Van de Kamp in particular felt the letter was perhaps a step too far, and called Iger to discuss it. Iger, being close to Eisner, was experiencing the letter's fallout when he answered the call. "We're really upset. Michael is frantic." Intended or not, Eisner saw this as a declaration of battle, and he was quick to fire back. The next day, Disney publicly disclosed that Gold's daughter worked at the company, which was a conflict of interest. But they did not only go after Gold. After the revelation that he had been considering pushing Eisner out, Ray Watson was also named as a non-independent, since his son worked at the company. Notably, some Eisner loyalists were named as well, including Revita Bowers, who was the principal of his children's former school. Under the new structure that Ira Milstein was in the process of developing, Gold and the rest of the named directors could soon be forced to step down. The next week, Eisner and Gold met for lunch. Eisner started off with a cool accusation. "Bruce Orwell told me he spoke to you," Eisner said, referring to a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. But Gold was not going to let that slide. "Let's take a f***ing lie detector test. I have not spoken to Bruce Orwell, so either he's lying or you're lying. Which one is it?" Bruce Orwell later denied ever speaking to Gold. But Eisner moved on from accusations to the real reason for the lunch. Eisner was there to ask Gold to resign from the governance and nominating committee. Gold refused, and instead said he wanted Eisner's resignation. He reminded Eisner that right at the beginning, Eisner had made a promise to leave if Gold or Roy ever asked him to. "I never said that," Eisner said. Gold was stunned. Eisner had said it many times, although it was now clear that he never really meant it. "Let me ask you, Michael, are you going to go out as a gentleman, or are you going to be carried out on your shield?" Eisner stood to leave. "Let me assure you, I'll be here long after you're gone." And with that, the men left, back to their respective sides of the battlefield. With the outside firm's results being revealed, the time was approaching for the board to meet and decide whether or not they should remove those deemed non-independent, as well as hear Eisner present his plan for the coming years of Disney. Before the day of the meeting, Eisner pulled Van de Kamp aside. "If you vote for that side," he said, referring to Roy and Gold, "you're off the board." But Van de Kamp was not intimidated. "Don't be like that. You're just upset. Stanley is not your enemy. He's worried about performance. Present a plan. Give the board a strategy. Tell us what you're going to do to bring us out of this mess. Don't divide us." On September 23, 2002, at 5 p.m., the board met to determine the future of the company. Along with Gold, Roy had made it a point to attend. First, it was time to decide if Gold was to remain as the chairman of the Governance and Nominating Committee. Many Eisner loyalists voted for Gold's removal, but despite Eisner's warning, Van de Kamp resisted. Since the board was unable to come to a consensus, Gold was allowed to remain as temporary co-chairman with George Mitchell for the time being. With that matter decided, Gold stood to make his statement to the board. Gold, along with Roy and their associates at Shamrock, had put together a detailed presentation lining out the issues they saw with Disney. Gold's main point was that from every economic metric, Disney was at a 7-year financial low. He highlighted that in particular, the purchases of ABC and Fox Family had cost the company billions. And worse, Gold presented a side-by-side comparison of management's claims regarding Disney's financial standing to the actual reality of the company's situation. Because so many on the board were beholden to Eisner, he controlled the flow of information and was able to spin the failures of the company as being less important than they actually were, or somebody else's fault. But it seemed hard to deny dishonesty from Eisner and team when it was shown so clearly. Gold continued to point out that Eisner's plan for the previous 5 years, as presented to the board previously, had fallen below projections further and further as each year passed. Gold also highlighted Disney's continued dependence on the success of Pixar animated movies rather than their own, and noted Eisner's inability to extend their contract. In full, the presentation ran for an hour and a half. It was a comprehensive and damning exploration of the Eisner era over the past 5 years. Roy had been sitting silently during the presentation, as he usually did during meetings, but both he and Gold expected this to serve as a wake-up call to the board members who had been left in the dark all this time. Gold concluded the presentation and then asked if there were any questions. Silence. Nobody raised a hand. The room felt cold and awkward. Eventually, Tom Stagg stood up to give a rebuttal to Gold's presentation, making the case that Gold was cherry-picking evidence to tarnish Eisner and his team. It was a tough case to make, but the point was not to disprove Gold. Most of the board, who remained silent, were merely concerned with remaining in Eisner's good graces. When Staggs concluded, Gold called for a vote on a management review, a real one this time, but George Mitchell asked Gold to withdraw the request. Gold looked around at the board. It was a room full of those loyal to Eisner. He looked to Eisner, sitting at the head of the table. Gold knew he could not overpower him alone, and so he relented. Eisner stood and gave his own presentation, pointedly ignoring the points that Gold had made beforehand. His action plan was for Disney to focus on the strengths of the brands it held, things like ESPN and ABC, so that they could secure more profits. He wanted to slash spending as a whole and focus on protecting their most lucrative assets. It was not necessarily a bad plan, but it was arguably a half measure, a partial solution, and in the end, it was not about his plan. Eisner was after one thing, and he stated it right after his presentation. Eisner said that due to the recent publicity covering supposed divisions within the board, he wanted everybody to send a message by giving his plan, and Eisner himself, a unanimous vote of confidence. I couldn't vote for that. Heads turned to the other side of the table, shocked to find that Roy, for once, had spoken up. Roy looked pointedly to Eisner. You don't have my support. Eisner's face reddened, boiling over with rage, but just as he was about to fire back, Mitchell asked Eisner, Iger, and the executive branch to leave the room. He wanted the board to discuss the matter privately. In the absence of Eisner and his team, the board had a heated debate. Both Roy and Gold reiterated the points of their presentation and refused to vote in support of Eisner. Mitchell helped the board compromise. They would not vote on Eisner's plan. Instead, they would put together a statement that expressed their, quote, overwhelming support for Eisner. This was just a PR move, and everybody knew it, which is why Mitchell was nervous when he called Eisner back in, only to reveal that they had been unable to vote on his plan. But Eisner cut him off, waving a piece of paper in his hand. I can't live with this, he exclaimed, staring straight at Gold and Roy. They're undermining me, leaking me to the press, and this proves it. While we were in this room, I've been emailed by someone at the LA Times about something we talked about 3 hours ago. He read the paper, which he claimed was an email he received from a reporter urging Eisner for an interview, mentioning that he would be interviewing the other side. Gold tried to deny this, but Eisner shouted over him. Stanley and Roy are trying to get rid of me. They don't think I can run this company. But who do you think can? Bob? Everybody turned to Bob Iger, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. Bob can't run this company. Everybody froze, as Eisner sat down again at the head of the table. Mitchell adjourned the meeting before things could get any worse. It was clear that Eisner would stop at nothing to hold on to his power, even if it meant trampling over those most loyal to him. Next time, we'll follow Eisner as he fights to keep his throne. As the company spirals and the board loses faith in him, Eisner pushes harder to eliminate any dissent and tries to win Roy back onto his side. Can Eisner mend his connection to Walt's nephew? Will the board regain their faith in the man who was once Disney's savior? Find out next time on Kings of the Magic Kingdom.